Hi guys, welcome to the second episode of our YouTube series on how to use the compositor in Blender version 2.8. For today's episode, we are going to be focusing on color correction. So by the end of this video, you will know how to use many of the color-based nodes in the compositor to improve the color grading of your images. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a node group for the denoise and blur nodes. To do that, we're going to left click and drag to create a selection box over the two nodes and release. So now each of these nodes have been selected. We're going to hit Ctrl and G on our keyboard to create a new group. To come out of this group, we're going to click on this button here, and you can see now we have a single node group that we can rename. So let's just rename this as denoise. And now we've got a single node where before we had two. And if we ever want to edit any of the properties of those nodes, we can click here to open up the group, and then we can make the changes. So for example, if we look to increase on the x-axis, we can do so here, allow it to composite, and it still has the same impact on the final result. So I'm just going to set that back to the value of 8 and then come out of the node group. Now let's have a look at some of the different ways in which we can manipulate the color values of our image. So we're going to start with the hue saturation value node. So hit Shift and A on your keyboard, go to the color menu and select hue saturation value, and we're going to position it here. So first of all, we have the image option here, which just plugs automatically into this denoise group, but we also have hue saturation value and factor. The hue value represents the color of the image. So if we change this hue value, then all of the colors in the image are going to change as well, and they can change quite substantially. So setting this all the way up to 1, for example, allows us to see what is effectively an inverted image in terms of the colors compared to the original. So where there was a dark red, there's now a very light blue. Where there was a very light blue, there's now this very reddish brown for the walls, etc. Then we have the saturation. The saturation is basically how strong the colors are. So if we reduce the value of the saturation, it creates a very washed out image. So let's demonstrate that by decreasing the value of the saturation. And if we just give that a moment to composite, you can see that the colors are still the same, but the entire image is far more washed out. if we increase the saturation value beyond 1, then we get a much greater level of contrast between these colours because they're much more vibrant in their appearance. And then we have the value option. Now this is effectively the brightness of the image overall. So if we decrease this value, then we are going to be decreasing the overall brightness of the image. And if we increase the value, we are in essence making our image brighter. The factor value represents how much of an effect this node has on our final result. So if we reduce this factor value, then the effects that the three values above have on the image are substantially reduced. So if I increase the saturation and the hue here, this is the result that we get when the factor value is set to 0.34. If we set it to 0, then these values basically don't really mean anything. And if we set this all the way to 1, it maximizes the impact that each of these values have. So the hue, the saturation, and the value are all in full effect if the factor is set to 1. So now that we know what the hue is, what the saturation is, and what this value means, let's take a look at a different mode used for color correction, and that is the RGB Curves node. Now, if you go to your Preferences panel, and then you look for an add-on known as Node Wrangler, so make sure that you are in the Add-ons tab, left click, and just type Node Wrangler. You want to make sure that this option is ticked. It just makes working with nodes a lot easier in Blender. So make sure that this is ticked and then close. So as long as the Node Wrangler add-on is active, what we can do here is we can select the hue saturation value node. We're going to hit Shift and S on our keyboard and go to the color menu and select RGB Curves. So how do RGB curves work? Well, we have 4 channels. So we have the main color channel, we have the red channel, green channel, and blue channel. And we can manipulate this curve here to change the influence of these colors and also change the amount of contrast in the image. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate how to change the contrast. So with the color channel selected, I'm going to start by adding 2 points to this curve. You can do so just by left clicking. So left click 1 and left click 2. Now we're going to position these points. So for example, if I wanted to reduce the contrast for this image, then I can take this point and bring it up and take this point and bring it down. So you can see that we are able to affect the contrast of the image. So a lot of it appears to be a bit more washed out because this part of the curve is almost completely flat. Not entirely flat, you can still see the curve there, but it has been flattened compared to what it was before. Now this area in the center of the curve, this represents the midtones of the image, and we'll get back to what midtones are when we have a look at a couple of other nodes. But for now, if I want to reverse this and increase the contrast, I can take this and bring it down and take this and bring it up. So now we have a different curve and it has a different impact on the level of contrast for our image. There are also points in the corners that you can manipulate. So if we grab this point and bring it up, then it will dramatically increase the brightness of the image. So here, if we really increase it, and let's actually bring this up as well, you can see that the image is starting to appear very white, but it also begins to appear very washed out because of the reduced contrast that this creates. So if we pop this point down here, the image appears brighter, almost foggier, but we still get quite a lot of contrast because of the shape of the curve. Now, on the other side, if we take this point and move it down, then this doesn't always have as strong as an effect, but it's basically making the darker parts of the image even darker. So if we position this lower, and then position this lower, you'll then begin to see that the darker areas, so under the bench for example, under the dodgeball, they begin to appear just that little bit darker as well. Now if we take this same point, move it all the way to the top, but also begin to move it across the top and release, then you actually begin to see something different. So with this curve, because it's so steep, it's making the brightest parts of the image extremely bright, but because of how steep the curve is, it's only affecting specific parts of the image. So with this, you can begin to get an idea of how the RGB curve can be used to prioritize different parts of the image depending on the levels of brightness and contrast. Now there are also other options here, so you can once again manipulate the factor value of the RGB curves to help determine exactly how much it's going to impact your image. You also have the ability to delete any points that you have created, so we can select this point for example and then click on this X button to delete it, and then let's do the same with this point and then reposition this in the corner. And then you have the black and white levels. So the black level is by default set to pure black and the white level is set to pure white. So with the black level here, if we increase this value, then what it will do is it will actually darken the image. So it kind of has the reverse effect to what you would expect. However, if we were to make the white level darker, so let's bring that value down, then it would actually make the image itself appear much brighter. And then you can manipulate the RGB channels independently. So for example, if we were to go to the blue channel here, we can begin to manipulate the values of the blue channel. And as we do that, you can actually begin to see that the tone of the image is beginning to change. So by bringing this point down, for example, we've added a very greenish tint to our entire image. If we bring it up here, for example, it's actually increasing the amount of blue that's present in the image. So now let's move on to our next node, which is going to be the color correction node. So make sure the RGB curves is selected, hit Shift and S, color, then color correction. Now this is quite a large node, so we're just going to grab our viewer node and move it across. And there are a lot of values in the color correction node, so I'm just going to go over what each of the values at the top are and also the ones at the side, and then that can give you an idea of what each of these values represent. So we have the saturation, which we have already discussed. So saturation is how strong a color is, so the lower this value, the more washed out that color is going to appear. The contrast value indicates just how much of a difference there is between those colors, but we should already be fairly familiar with these two by now. What are quite new terms are the gamma, the gain, and the lift. Now next we have the gamma value. So if we increase the gamma value here to 1.5, what this is going to do is it's actually going to brighten the overall image. If we decrease this value below 1, so to 0.0 to 0.5, then it's going to darken the image, but it's going to keep the level of contrast and saturation that is currently set. Now, these gamma values, they will affect the image as a whole, especially when we're manipulating the master value. However, it prioritizes the midtones. So you have the shadows of the image, you have highlights in the image, which are normally where the light bounces off the brighter colors, like the cones, for example. And then everything in between that is the midtones. So when we manipulate the gamma value, we are mainly manipulating the midtone levels, but it does overlap to affect the shadows and the highlights as well. Now, the gain value has a stronger influence on the highlights of the image, but again, there is always going to be an overlap, so it is going to affect the overtone or the midtones and the shadows as well. Now, if I set the gamma back to 1 and then increase the gain acts as a multiplier. So it acts as a multiplier to effectively up the brightness of the image without adversely affecting the shadows of the image. So if we increase this to a very high value, for example, you can see that the image becomes very, very bright, but it's still very clear where the shadows are located. Now, if we reduce this below 1, then that will basically reduce the highlights and create an overall darker looking image. And then finally, we have the lift option here. Now, the lift option is not a multiplier like the gain, and it generally prioritizes the shadows. So the value of the lift is set to 0, and you can make it either positive or negative. So if you increase this value above 0, this adds brightness to the overall image itself rather than multiplying it, which is why you can see that it has affected the contrast and saturation of the image as well. Now, if we manipulated the gain, you would see that that would not be the case. So if we set that back to 0 and increase the gain to around 2, you can see that we are able to brighten the image, but we do not necessarily lose our level of saturation in the colors. If we set that back to 1 and reduce the lift below 0, then we will begin to darken the overall image. Now, each of those values focused on the master channel, so it influences the image as a whole. But if you want to better isolate parts of the image, you can use some of the values below. So, for example, if I wanted to increase the contrast of the shadows, I can increase this value here. So if we increase that to say 1.7, you can see that all of the shadows have become a lot darker. In fact, that's too dark for my taste. Now, with many of these values, it's preferable to make minor changes. So going from 1 to 1.7 here was a substantial change to the look of our image, and it doesn't represent itself very well. So if we change this to say 1.1, then we might get something that looks a little bit better. So here we can see that the shadows appear darker than what they did before, but not so dark that we begin to lose the detail. We might also want to perhaps increase the gain in the highlights. So if we increase the highlights a lot, so 2.7, this doesn't actually appear to be having as much a difference, because as a multiplier, the gain value actually is a little bit better behaved than some of the others, such as the lift option, for example. But here we could, to avoid things getting washed out, perhaps use a value of 1.3 to just increase the gain of the highlights. And then maybe let's do one more. Let's increase the saturation of the midtones. So we can increase the saturation here, and if we choose a higher value, so we can go up to 4, the maximum value, it really adds to the saturation of all of the areas that Blender considers to be in that sort of middle of the range area for the contrast. So if we take this and we push it down to something like 1.3, just to add a bit more saturation to the floor and the walls, etc. And if you have a look down here at our viewer node and render result, you can compare these two images and begin to see some of the changes that are taking effect because of the nodes that we have set up and because of the changes that we have made to the color correction. So up next, we're going to demonstrate the color balance node, which can work in a similar way to color correction. So hit Shift and S and change it to color balance. And this time, instead of numerical values, we have these color wheels here that we can manipulate. Now, when manipulating the color balance, again, like the color correction, it's important to remember that a lot of the time you will only need to make slight adjustments to your images. Now, we should know at this point what lift, gamma and gain do. So we have the lift option here. So if we were to increase the brightness value for the lift, then it increases the overall brightness of our image. And then if we decrease this value, then it will add darkness to the image as well, but it focuses here, you can see, more on the shadows. So in this case, it does appear to work just a little bit differently to our color correction. So if we go back to our color correction, and actually rather than just swapping out, let's just add it in. So go color correction, and I end up swapping it out by mistake. So let's bring the viewer node back in, and then hit Shift A, color correction. And we're just going to take a minute to just compare these two. So if I just mute this with the M key, brings it back to the way it was before. And then we manipulate the lift value here, so reduce the master lift. You can actually see that the lift value here has a much stronger effect than manipulating the color balance. So what I would like to do normally is, if I was to use both of these nodes, which you can do absolutely, then what I would do is I would manipulate the lift value of the color balance and then just keep the lift value here set to 0. Now don't forget, you do have other lift values that you can manipulate as well. So if I mute this again and then set the shadow value of the lift to point, or should I say, let's just go -0.2, that begins to look a little bit more like what we get over here, but then it really focuses on the shadows and doesn't affect the rest of the image as much. So you can play about with these two separate nodes to see which effects you prefer to use. Personally, I prefer to use the lift values in the color balance node because I feel like I have just that little bit more control and the effects are just a little bit more subtle. So hit the M key to bring the color balance node back into effect, and then I'm just going to increase this value to about here. Then we have the gamma values here, which we can affect using this slider. So we can increase the gamma value to a brighter color, or we can decrease the gamma value to a darker tone. And then finally we have the gain, which again acts as a multiplier, mainly for the highlights. So we can increase this value to increase the gain in our highlights and make the overall image appear much brighter. or we can reduce the gain to make the overall image appear darker. So I'm just going to set that back to roughly the center. And before we switch up what nodes we're using again, you may notice that we have the option to change the formula that is used for the color balance. So if we left click, we actually have two options. We have lift gamma gain, which is what we've been using, and then offset power slope. So if we go offset power slope, the offset replaces the lift, the power replaces the gamma, and the slope replaces the gain. Now the power, for example, is effectively the gamma but inverted. So if we increase the brightness of the power, we are effectively going to make the image itself darker. And then if we perform the opposite effect, then we make the overall image appear brighter. But you can also see we begin to lose a bit of detail here as well. Now the offset, which replaces the lift option, actually adjusts the overall brightness of the image. Now the lift option focuses mainly on the shadows in general. So if we manipulate the lift option again, and we have to remember that we have adjusted the gamma, so we need to reset that, then you will see that we're able to manipulate the image as a whole with the lift, but the priority is on the darker areas. Now when it comes to the offset, you can see here that if we set this to the center here, then we end up with a very washed out image. So actually for the offset, this is normally by default set to its darkest value. Now we can manipulate the basis value here if we ever wanted to change that. Then finally we have the slope, which acts very similarly to the gain. It's again a multiplier. So if we increase this value, so let's make the value brighter for the slope, then it's going to focus mainly on increasing the brightness of the highlights. And then we can decrease the brightness of those highlights by reducing this value. And again, we can see that it does have that effect on the image overall. But the slope, much like the gain does in color correction, focuses on the highlights of the image in particular. Now, while we have looked at many different nodes for color correction, or quite a few I should say, not too many, but we've had a look at things like hue, saturation, value, color correction, color balance, etc. There are some color nodes that I personally consider to be a little bit redundant. So I'm just going to show you one of these other nodes as an example. So we'll go Shift A, color, and you can see we've got options like this gamma option here, which is a very simple node, and it's been around for a very long time at this point. And all it is you just plug into the image input and then plug the output into the image input here for the viewer node. And then you can use the gamma value, and it's already had an effect on the image. And all you can do is just increase the gamma value here. So we can increase it to 1.8. And what that does is it almost acts like the power value here in the color balance. So if I was to actually use a split viewer node for this, so let's hit Shift A, and then go output split viewer. We're going to take the color correction here and pop it into the image node here. And then we're going to take the gamma and plug it into here and left click to view. So if I set this down to 1, we should have very similar images either side. Now the reason why there is a slight difference is because of the color balance node that isn't completely set to its default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the color balance node with the M key. And then that should level out both sides of this image. And now if we just compare the gamma value here to the gamma value here, if we increase this gamma value to a value of 1.8 and then press enter, you can see that it makes the overall image a lot brighter. But if we do the same thing with the gamma value here, so set it to 1.8, then it effectively does the reverse operation and begins to make the image appear darker. Now, because this is a value that can be manipulated both in color correction and in color balance, but in different ways, I tend to never use nodes like the gamma node. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to delete the gamma node by pressing X, and let's delete the split viewer as well, and just plug color correction back in so that we can once again view the image. Now I'm going to set the gamma back to 1. And now I'm going to show you yet another node, but this time I'm going to demonstrate how you can convert your image to a black and white image. So it's going to go from RGB to black and white. So we're going to go Shift and A to once again bring up our add menu, but instead of going to the color menu, we are instead going to go to the converter menu, and we are going to select RGB to BW. So this represents the red, green, blue image and converts it to a black and white image. So we're going to left click and we're going to bring it into our setup, and if I attach it here and let that composite, it converts our entire image from RGB to grayscale. So now there is absolutely no saturation in our image whatsoever. This node here completely eliminates all of the saturation in the image. But what if you wanted to convert the image to effectively be black and white with the exception of a single color? So for example, what if I wanted to have my entire image appear as it does, but for the red of the dodgeball to still be saturated? Well, I can do that with a different node altogether. So select the RGB to BW and then hit Shift S to change it, and then we're going to go color, and this time we're going to go hue correct. So as soon as we do that, you can see that our image is back to normal in terms of its colors. But we can see if we zoom in on our hue correct node here, we have a spectrum going from red to yellow to green to blue, etc. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to isolate the red of the dodgeball. So we can do that by grabbing any of these points that are located in the channels for the other colors, and then just lower this down to the bottom. As soon as I do that, you will begin to see that it's having an effect here on our floor. Now if I take this one and move it all the way down, just let that composite, now the entirety of our floor here has lost its color because the green values here have basically been set to 0. So let's continue to do that with these other colors. So just bring them down, and as we continue to do that, we continue to reduce the colors that are visible in our image. So I'm going to reduce this one to about here, and let's reduce the yellow, and then just bring this one across and bring this one across as well. And there we go. So now if we zoom out and just pan our view, you can see that we have an image where we have been able to isolate a single color in our render and effectively desaturate the rest of the image. So that's going to finish up how we can use different nodes to affect the colors that are visible in our rendered image. In the next tutorial, we're going to be looking at nodes that allow us to create distortions to our image and also learn how we can overlay one image on top of another. Thanks guys, I hope you have learned a lot in this tutorial and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching guys. If you are interested in learning more about Blender, then feel free to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, which gives you updates on all things Blender, including future releases of Blender, tips and tricks on how to use some of your favorite tools, recommendations for things like tutorials, courses, as well as things like add-ons or websites that can improve your Blender experience. So thanks guys, and I hope to see you in the next video.